The 2010s were an insane decade for racing games, and that decade had two different sides to it. On one side you had the titans like Forza, which was rising to its dominance, Gran Turismo was still carrying that prestige, and Need for Speed was constantly reinventing itself. I mean, sometimes successfully, sometimes maybe not so much, but underneath those heavy hitters, there were games experimenting and taking risks and trying some new ideas, and some of them were genuinely really good. Today we're talking about racing games from the 2010s that deserved way more attention than they got. Hopefully there'll be something here that you've not heard of before that maybe after this you can go and check out. Or maybe you've heard of them all because you know a lot about racing games. But anyway, before we jump onto the list, we need to start with an honourable mention. So to kick off, this is Modnation Racers, my honourable mention for this video. The reason it's an honourable mention is because I very recently covered this game in my underrated PSP racing games video, so it's already had its own segment in like the last week. But anyway, if you owned a PS3 in 2010, you probably remember the marketing push behind Modnation Racers. Sony was basically positioning it as their answer to Mario Kart, but if I were to call it a clone, then that would be missing the point entirely. Because what made Modnation Racers special wasn't just the racing, of course, it was the creation tools. You could design your own driver from scratch, customize your kart piece by piece, and the best part, build entire tracks with elevation changes, jumps, shortcuts, so on and so forth. And this was 2010, so user-generated content wasn't nearly as mainstream as it is today. The track editor was surprisingly deep, you could sculpt terrain like it was clay, build banked corners, and create some wild rollercoaster style circuits. And the online sharing system actually worked. The driving was a little bit floaty, yeah sure, and the load times weren't great, but the creativity was unmatched for a kart racer at the time. And it had a dedicated community. People were designing tracks that, to be honest, rivaled and were better than developer-made ones. Yes, it would go on to get a kind of sequel on the PS Vita, but in my opinion this is a franchise that should still be going today. On PS4, PS5, it should have had sequels on the home consoles as well. Anyway, unfortunately the series slowly faded, but if we're talking ambition in racing games, Modnation Racers definitely belongs in the conversation. Now let's move on to the main list. So this is Blur, and Blur might be the biggest how did this not take off story on this list. This was developed by Bizarre Creations, as in the same studio behind Project Gotham Racing and Metropolis Street Racer. Blur was a fascinating mashup. Imagine real licensed cars, real world city tracks, but with arcade handling and Mario Kart style power-ups. It sounds chaotic, and it kinda was. But here's what made Blur different. It still respected racing skill. You couldn't just rely on power-ups to win because drifting mattered, taking racing lines mattered, and managing boost and defensive abilities also mattered. The power-ups were okay, they were pretty layered, shields, mines, homing attacks. You could use them and stack them strategically. And multiplayer was where this game truly shined. Split-screen chaos, online ranked playlists, some decent skill-based matchmaking before that became standard. But the problem was, well, I guess the timing. It launched in 2010, which was a year packed with major releases, and it was kinda hard to market because it was too arcade for sim fans, but too realistic for kart fans. It kinda lived in this awkward middle ground. But today, that middle ground feels really refreshing. Blur was competitive, chaotic, and skill-driven in a way that still feels modern today, and it did not deserve to disappear as quickly as it did and should have had a sequel. On top of this, the game would review very well across all versions released, so that was PS3, Xbox 360, and PC, where all versions held a score between 81 to 82 on Metacritic, and it currently holds an 8.1 user score. Unfortunately, the game wouldn't be the best seller across all of its platforms, selling 500,000 units across the two consoles and PC, which, when you divide it on platform to platform and compare it to other big racing franchises at the time, isn't as much, and it's a shame because this game should have sold well, or at least better than it did, and gone on to start its own franchise, but of course Bizarre Creations is now sadly long gone. In fact, Blur was one of their last ever games before Activision shut them down, so thanks a bunch Activision, I guess. Now before we go any further, if you're a fan of racing games, then please consider hitting that subscribe button and tapping the bell to stay up to date with my future uploads. And if you haven't done so already, please consider hitting that like button because it helps out a lot more than you might think. Anyway, let's move on to our next game, and that is Test Drive Unlimited 2. Now, this one was very ambitious. Test Drive Unlimited 2 wasn't just trying to be a racing game, it was aiming for more of a lifestyle experience vibe. Massive open worlds based on Ibiza and Hawaii. You could buy mansions and apartments, walk inside dealerships, change your clothes, visit social hubs, challenge players organically, and this was before open world racing was dominating the genre. The sense of scale in this game was insane. You could drive for real life distances without hitting invisible walls, cruise coastal highways in a convertible Ferrari, join online car meets. It felt like an early prototype of what modern racing games would become. Was the handling perfect? Not really. Were there bugs at launch? Yes, there were. But the vision was massive. It leaned heavily into atmosphere, the soundtrack, the sunset lighting, the freedom to just cruise around and do whatever you wanted. It walked so games like Forza Horizon could run. And that's why this game deserves a lot of recognition, because it took everything about the first Unlimited and just made it bigger. Now, whilst the first game was a massive hit and reviewed really well, unfortunately Unlimited 2 did not hold a score quite as high. It was released across 3 different platforms again, so PS3, 360 and PC, and across those versions we have a 68, a 70 and a 72 out of 100, with a user score across the board of about a 6.9 to 7 out of 10. The game would still go on to sell pretty damn well, with 1.8 million units shifted across all 3 different platforms, so definitely a lot better than Blur did. And as I'm sure you may know, Test Drive Unlimited did eventually return with Test Drive Unlimited Solar Crown, which is, well, certainly a video game, and a video game I intend to tackle in a video one day, but I have not yet got around to playing it. So next up we have what might be the most tragic story on this list, Driveclub. When it was first revealed, it was positioned as a flagship PS4 title, a showcase racer, a technical powerhouse, or some would call it a social racing revolution. And then when it launched, it was, well, broken. The server failures crippled the club system, which was literally the core feature and main selling point of the game. The PlayStation Plus free version was delayed for months, and unfortunately the review scores reflected frustration more than the actual driving experience. And of course, in today's gaming landscape, first impressions are everything. And here's what gets overlooked. Underneath those server issues was a genuinely special racing game. Let's talk about the driving, because Driveclub wasn't a pure sim, but it wasn't arcade either. It sat in this sweet middle ground. Heavy weighty cars that demanded respect, but still accessible enough to slide around with confidence, and that most people could just pick up and play. There was a real sense of mass to each vehicle, and when you clipped a curb at high speed, you felt it. When you pushed too hard into a wet corner, the car would punish you, but it didn't feel unfair. And then there's the presentation. Even now, over a decade later, Driveclub's weather system holds up. Rain wasn't just a texture overlay, it interacted with light, it distorted reflections, it pulled on the track's surface. At night, racing through a storm felt almost cinematic. The combination of sound design and dynamic lighting created this immersive intensity that very few races have matched since. And the sound design was absolutely brutal in the best possible way. Engines roared with deep mechanical texture, downshifts cracked, turbo flutter echoed through tunnels. But the most underrated part of Driveclub for me was its club progression system. You joined or created a club with other players, every race you completed contributed points to said club, challenges rotated constantly, leaderboards weren't just global, they were a social thing. It felt collaborative without being forced, competitive without being too toxic. Over time, the developers, Evolution Studios, fixed the servers, added bikes in a full expansion, introduced new tracks, refined physics, and transformed the game into something far stronger than its launch state. And then, it got delisted. In 2020, Driveclub was officially delisted from digital storefronts due to licensing expirations. I'm so bored of hearing that when it comes to delisting. It's always licensing, and that's it. No more digital purchases, servers shut down. Physical copies still work offline, but the social component that defined the game is gone, which makes this game even more bittersweet. Driveclub didn't fail because it lacked quality, it failed because of timing, launch issues, and momentum. The game would go on to review at about 71 out of 100 on Metacritic with a user score of 6.4 out of 10. I'm sure you already knew this, but if you didn't, this was a PlayStation 4 exclusive. The game did sell really well with nearly 5 million units shifted, but I think this one's underrated because it's just faded into time thanks to its delisting. So moving on, when people think of Formula 1 games, they think of realism. Tyre compound, DRS, ERS, sim-heavy career modes. So when Codemasters announced F1 Race Stars, a cartoon racer with big-headed caricatures of real drivers, the reaction was confusion. But here's the thing, F1 Race Stars understood something important. The Formula 1 brand is global, it's multi-generational, and not everyone wants a hyper-technical sim. This game took real circuits, Monaco, Silverstone, Monza, and reimagined them like theme park roller coasters. Massive elevation changes, shortcut routes, exaggerated landmarks, and looping track designs. They weren't just shrunk down circuits, they were creative reinterpretations. And the power-up system was fairly well balanced. Boost bursts, defensive bubbles, oil slicks, track hazards. It wasn't as chaotic as Mario Kart, but it wasn't shallow either. The handling model was tighter than you'd expect, boost management mattered, track knowledge mattered. The only thing was, it was a kart racer and there was no drifting, but that is also because it's F1. The game had some decent split-screen multiplayer, and really, F1 Race Stars filled a niche. It allowed families and casual players to enjoy the F1 universe without needing to understand pit strategy or tyre degradation. And visually, I think it's aged really well. The stylized art direction means it doesn't suffer the same graphical aging that realism-focused games often do. It even had a decent online component and some post-launch support with some DLC. So why didn't it blow up? Well, because it kind of lived in an awkward space. The hardcore F1 fans dismissed it as too childish, and kart racer fans stuck with Nintendo's dominance. But in retrospect, it was very creative, it was polished, and bold. And we honestly don't get many big budget experimental spin-offs like this anymore, which makes F1 Race Stars feel like a relic of a more playful era in licensed games. The game reviewed alright, with scores between 61 to 64, depending on the platform it was on, and this was a game that launched on the 360, PS3, PC, and eventually got ported to Wii U as well. The user score is sat at about 6.6, so it's fairly similar as well, but I personally really like this game. Across all platforms, the game would go on to sell about 600,000 copies, which isn't too bad going, but not that great in terms of F1 sales. Anyway, if you're super interested in this game, then I actually have done a full video on it, so go and check that one out after this video. And moving on to something a little bit different for the final game of this video. This is Fast RMX. Developed by Shin En, this game was a launch title for the Nintendo Switch back in 2017, and quietly became one of the most technically impressive titles on the system. And not just at the time, I still think it is to this day. It held 60 FPS, it had dynamic lighting, some really cool track design, and it performed really well both in docked and handheld mode. But what makes the game stand out for me is the phase switching mechanic. Your vehicle has two energy phases, blue and orange. The track is lined with matching boost pads, and if you match your phase to the colour, you get a speed boost. If you don't, well, you lose momentum. And at 300 mph equivalent speeds, that split decision making becomes very intense. You're steering, boosting, avoiding rivals, switching phases mid-corner. It creates this rhythmic, almost musical flow once you master it. The track design is vertical and ambitious, giant drops, twisting skyways, futuristic cities, and unlike some futuristic racers that feel floaty, Fast RMX has tight, responsive handling. You feel in control, but the speed is punishing, and if you make one mistake on the higher difficulties, that's it. You're losing. It also supports split-screen multiplayer and handles it very smoothly. And this is a game that's underrated because it kind of launched quietly, it wasn't tied to a massive franchise, and it kind of exists in the shadow of the dormant F-Zero series that we're constantly waiting to return. But in many ways, Fast RMX is the spiritual successor that people were asking for. It's challenging, skill-based, and performance-focused. So the game was a Nintendo Switch exclusive, and will review pretty well with 81 out of 100 and a matching 8.1 user score to go with it. Unfortunately, because this was a digital exclusive game, I don't really have any accurate sales figures to give you, but Fast RMX did go on to get a sequel just last year that was a Switch 2 launch title called Fast Fusion. And who knows, perhaps that will one day end up in a video of underrated 2020s racing games. But anyway, that takes us to the end of our list. The 2010s were experimental for racing games. Some ideas did fail, some succeeded kinda quietly, and some were just a bit misunderstood. But these games, they took some really cool risks. They tried to blend different genres, like in Blur, they pushed online features early, like Driveclub, and they experimented with tone. And while not all of them may have become household names, I think they helped shape what modern racing games look like today, especially with Test Drive Unlimited 2. So here's the real question. Which underrated racing game from the 2010s do you think deserve better? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, please consider hitting that subscribe button. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers for the continued support, and all I really have left to say is thanks and goodbye.